So you just watched NASCAR Full Speed, or maybe you've watched enough of this channel to where I have converted you into the cult of oval racing. So now, naturally you might want to watch a NASCAR race or two. But whether we'd like to admit it or not, if you turn on the TV as a first-time NASCAR viewer, it really does just look like a bunch of cars driving around in circles. So I want to help with that. Today, I want to cover some terms, concepts, and ideas about NASCAR racing that I use myself when I'm watching NASCAR to really help give me a fuller picture of what's going on in the race. NASCAR Full Speed did a great job showing off the characters and personalities of the drivers along with explaining the basics of NASCAR as a whole, but at the end of the day, when you turn on the TV on Sunday, you're going to be watching racing. So let's get right to the racing. First off, the rules, and how does it affect what the drivers are strategizing for and racing for on a week-to-week basis? By now, you're probably at least aware of NASCAR's most current rule set with the stages in the races and the playoffs at the end of the season, and it's probably a little bit confusing to you still, but I want to talk about how that affects team strategies. Because of these rules, there are pretty much 3 completely different schools of thought on how to approach a race, and it really depends on both your tolerance of gambling and how competitive you think your car is in the first place. The interesting about this is you will see all 3 of these schools of thought play out in real time in the same race. The first school of thought is maximizing finishing position. So if you have a very strong car, you don't really want to take any gambles. For instance, if a caution comes out right before a stage end, you want to pit before that, because if you wait to get the points at the stage end, then you have to pit afterwards, you will lose a bunch of track position for no reason besides points. The people who usually stick on these optimal finishing position strategies are people that think that they have a pretty decent chance to win a race or two over the course of the regular season. I would say the majority of the top 15 to 20 cars all stay in line here, except for a couple teams that are very prone to gambling, like what comes to my mind is Brad Keselowski. The second school of thought is maximizing stage points. There are a couple reasons that you would want to do this. One, if you feel like you probably don't have the best chance of locking yourself into the playoffs with a win over the course of the season, you want to pick up points anywhere you can. But at the same time, the other reason you could do it if you were a little bit more competitive is because there are more bonus points in the playoffs for cars that have a higher finishing position in the standings. And those are a lot more valuable than people like to give them credit for, especially towards the beginning of the season. In my opinion, NASCAR actually does a great job balancing playoff points for them to actually mean something in the playoffs. The last school of thought is for teams that hover in that 20th to 30th place competitive spot, and it is people who just throw stuff at the wall and gamble at any opportunity they can to try to get that win to lock them into the playoffs. Over 90% of the time, their strategies won't work out and cost them more points in the given race, but they only need it to work once for them to cash in on it. So when you're watching NASCAR, especially near a stage's end or in the middle of a long green flag run, keep a lookout for what strategies are going on, keep tabs on the field, who's pitting, who's giving up track position, who just wants to maximize their finishing position, and who wants to play points, because all of that stuff to me is very interesting to see happen side by side. The next topic I'm going to cover is aerodynamics and what that means in NASCAR with the huge hole that they're punching through the air, because it leads to a lot of very interesting things that you don't see in a lot of other types of racing. First, something that probably everybody knows about in one way or another is bump drafting, when you literally can bump the other car in front of you to gain speed by working together with less of an aero drag. But when you're watching the Daytona 500, I want to point out the difference between a good bump draft and a bad bump draft, because you will see a lot of both as the race goes on. A good bump draft really takes 2 to tango, because both cars have to be pretty much in sync with their lateral movement. The biggest thing about bump drafting isn't necessarily the location on the bumper where you hit it, though sometimes if you are too offset that can cause issues as well. The biggest issue is when cars are moving side to side relative to each other upon contact. That's when pretty much all of the wrecks happen. So when I'm watching those big packs bump drafting everywhere, I'm trying to guess where the wreck is going to come from. I'm seeing that maybe one car is really squirrely side to side relative to the other people in the line and say, hey, that's the guy that it's going to happen to. Races like the Daytona 500 really aren't as much luck as you would initially believe. Really, the people who are able to give and take great bump drafts are the ones who end up in position to win, with only the very occasional lucky winner because of some massive drama. But my favorite type of drafting in NASCAR isn't even bump drafting. It is something called side drafting, and you will see it a lot, especially with the NASCAR Cup cars. Side drafting is when you can pull up right next to the quarter panel of the car in front of you and divert more air than normal onto their spoiler, causing increased drag, causing the front car to slow down. This is almost like natural DRS when it comes to NASCAR, and it sets up the majority of passes in the modern NASCAR landscape. The places where side drafting is the most effective is the bigger tracks where the straightaways are longer and that drag can mean more. But if you have too long of a straightaway, you can actually time your side draft incorrectly, because by the time you pull ahead of the car in front of you, they can just side draft you back. So the beauty of it is you have to not only side draft someone, but you have to side draft them at the right time to where you are the car with the nose in front as you head into the next corner. But speaking of corners, the final type of air I want to talk about is the sucky one, dirty air. Dirty air has been a recurring problem in NASCAR ever since the cars became very low to the ground. Essentially, the wake of the front car dumps turbulent air onto the second place car if they are following each other, making it very unpredictable in the corners and usually leading to a tight condition for the car behind. Something very interesting to watch when you watch NASCAR is how drivers manipulate for dirty air and around dirty air. So you'll see the front car tend to try to dump dirty air on the rear car at the most inopportune time when the car behind is trying to turn the most. But at the same time, especially at tracks that have more than one race group, the second place car can search around and avoid the dirty air of the front car by taking a completely different line. This leads to a really fun game of chicken between the first and second place car, where the first place car tries to guess where the second place car is going and the second place car is trying to guess where the first place car is going. A lot of races seem to end on this with a battle for the lead, and it usually ends one of two ways. Either the front car is able to hold off the rear car, or the rear car is finally able to get to that quarter panel of the front car and side draft. Next up is tires and tire strategy. One of the coolest parts about NASCAR, in my opinion, is the ability of people to be on different tire strategies, even on the same set of tires. At many tracks, especially older ones that haven't seen a repave in a couple decades, tires are a commodity. You will see different strategies with tires play out in real time. Some people will try to go for track position at the beginning of a run by pushing their tires to their limit while knowing that they are going to be slower at the end of the run, while others play a more optimal route where they can be saving tires at the beginning by not pushing them as hard and then having a faster car essentially at the end of the run for free. Now the downside to that though is that if a caution comes out and everyone comes down for another set of tires, the people who pushed at the beginning keep their track position. It's like in Formula 1 when you see soft tires versus hard tires and then a safety car comes out and screws up the field, but that's a much more common occurrence in NASCAR than it is in Formula 1. In NASCAR, there's usually a twist like that pretty much every single race where something doesn't go according to plan for somebody. Not to mention that sometimes teams put too much camber in their cars and cause their tires to have a life that doesn't even cover a full fuel run. So when you're watching NASCAR and it's starting to get into a zone, into a little lull where you see cars driving around, try to pick out who are the people that are really trying to keep their tires on their car and who are people that are just going for it and trying to pray for a caution. And a lot of the times you'll be right about your predictions on who's going to come back through the field, who's going to pass more cars at the end. But sometimes there's just a car who's having an off day that sucks for the whole run, and sometimes there's a car who is just legendary that can be fast for the entire run. Next, I want to talk about the differences in track types in NASCAR because it's easy just to lump everything together and say there are ovals and road courses in NASCAR, but in reality, many oval courses drive completely different to one another, and here's how to recognize how. The first type of track is called a super speedway, which has pack racing, where every car pretty much stays within the draft unless you are driving a literal sardine can. This is the type of racing we talked about earlier with bump drafting, and it's going to be something that NASCAR is trying to emphasize at more tracks, even the smaller ones. So Atlanta didn't used to be like this, but they repaved it with enough banking to where it kind of became it. And also they're looking into making other tracks like this too, like Texas. it's something that might be good for TV ratings, but a lot of hardcore NASCAR fans only like pack racing in little bits. The next type of racing is intermediate racing, and arguably this is NASCAR's bread and butter. These are tracks that are between about 1.25 miles and maybe 2 miles. So everywhere from a Nashville to a Auto Club, or I guess since Auto Club is gone, a Michigan. This type of racing does not see draft packs past a couple laps after the restart and tends to string out, but this is still mostly about throttle control and about trail braking to a sense. Car balance becomes extremely important because the cars are completely on edge through these corners where if they are a little bit too loose, the car can snap and they'll lose it, but if the car is too tight, they will just be at an extreme disadvantage to all the other cars that are able to get on the throttle faster than them. As you're watching these races, it's pretty fun to try to guess whether the car you're watching is handling tight, neutral, or a little bit loose. So if you see the right rear hang out, you'll go, oh yeah, that's a loose race car. But if you see a car kind of sneak up and up to the wall and then maybe almost hit it but just barely stay off of it, that's how you can tell they're feeling tight and they're probably very unhappy in the car. And the last type is this short track oval, which is anything really 1 mile or below in the NASCAR definition of things. These tracks are where everything gets a lot more physical. The cars are driving at generally slower speeds, so there's some more contact, and also passing doesn't really work with the side drafting anymore, so you'll see a lot of bumps, a lot of beating and banging, basically everyone trying to get ahead of the other car by any means necessary. Recently, short track racing has kind of suffered from an inability to pass because of some of the dirty air that the car is producing, but NASCAR is trying to take steps towards that, and until then it's going to be a little more beating and banging than we're used to. And finally, road courses. The current iteration of the NASCAR Cup car is starting to handle more like a real road car on road courses, but in the old days, man, these NASCARs really did not like the road courses, and it made them a heck of a lot of fun to watch these people wrangle these boats around them. Road racing, you'll start to see a lot of pit strategy on stage points and stuff like that we were talking about earlier, just because of how weird the stages play out in these races. But at the same time, you will see a lot of strung out cars, almost like a Formula One race, with maybe a little bit more contact than you're used to. And the one thing that really catches people off guard about NASCAR Road is track limits. There is no such thing as track limits in NASCAR, except for at Daytona and Talladega on the yellow line for the apron. But going to road courses, absolutely none of that. So when you see the line at Road America that these cars take, the F1 fans are going to think that it's sacrilegious, and it's really funny. Personally, my favorite type of racing is when an intermediate track goes multi-groove, meaning that there are multiple lines that are about the same speed, which will cause cars to really come and go, lots of passing, lots of cool moves, something called a slide job, which you might have heard of, where you try to dive bomb a car into the corner and then slide up in front of them. That's a very common way to pass cars now, especially in NASCAR, and dirt racing is where it's from. And finally, some smaller quickfire topics that you might hear brought up in a NASCAR race that you want to probably know the definition of. Pit stop adjustments that you make into your car. You can change the wedge, you can change the track bar, you can change the air pressure in your tires, and if you want to spend a little bit of extra time on pit road, you can add or take away spring rubbers. All of these are meant to make the car handle loose or tight. Lap cars become more of a factor in NASCAR than in other types of racing because of the lucky dog rule, where the first car 1 lap down gets their lap back. This leads to cars about to go 1 lap down racing leaders harder than probably any other series in the world, because of if they time that caution correctly, they can get right back up to the field. There is no real rules about holding up the leader. You can race them as hard as you want, and you'll see a lot of drama in races because of that. Progressive banking is when each lane on a track has a slightly different banking, usually ranging between 2 or 4 degrees apart from each other. This is used to make the track more multi-groove so that each lane becomes more viable. Probably the best example of this is a track that the Cup is going to for the first time this year, which is Iowa, and I'm very excited to watch that race, so maybe mark that one on your calendar. Teammates. How much do teammates matter in NASCAR? The answer is mostly not, except sometimes. So the sometimes is definitely at super speedways like Daytona and Talladega, where you need drafting partners. You'll see teams and manufacturers band together for sure there. But most of the other times, teammates drive each other as hard as they would anybody else, except for maybe making sure never to full out wreck each other. But that doesn't mean we haven't seen teammates wreck each other before. There are a lot of very interesting team meetings that happen that you'll see incidents for. what damage really affects the race car. So if we take a car like this one, if something on the front of the nose obviously would affect the aerodynamics pretty bad, so anything really here that you can't buff back out is going to slow down your car. Along with that, the other critical part is this right rear quarter panel. If you push in that right rear quarter panel, the car doesn't have as much to push against the air in the corner, so your grip will go way down, the aero grip. Anything that you hit more flush on the car, and even especially on the left side where it's not pushing up against the air as much, there might be a little bit of drag associated with it, but your cornering won't be that bad compared to if you really just punch in that right rear. And anything along like the rear bumper cover can be completely harmless if done in the correct, like right in the center. Penalties. There are a lot of penalties that you can get in NASCAR, more than I could ever list in this video, but the majority of them will happen on pit road. So when you get a pit road penalty under caution, all you have to do is go back to the tail end of the longest line. But if you get a penalty under green flag conditions, then you have to do a pass through pit road at pit road speed as everyone else is still going at the green flag. There are more extreme penalties that require you to do a stop and hold that you don't see all too often. And then if you do something like intentionally wreck somebody very egregiously, you can be held for a couple laps or just parked in general. That's very rare though. If you're thinking this might be the first Daytona 500 you'll ever watch, let me know in the comments below if you have any other questions. And if you're a NASCAR fan already, let me know something that I might have missed that other people should know. Alright, thank you all for watching. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you all on the track.